Hand me the company laptop, Rachel.
My husband said it in front of 19 employees, 2 foremen, our office coordinator, and his mother, as casually as if he were asking me to pass him a tape measure. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. Daniel Bennett stood at the head of the conference table. Barbara, his mother, was sitting beside him in the seat I had used during Monday meetings for almost 10 years. I looked at him. What? The laptop, he repeated, and the company card. Nobody moved. A few people lowered their eyes. Sam Ortega, our senior foreman, stared at Daniel with the expression he used when something at a job site made no sense. Daniel held out his hand. From now on, purchases, contract changes, and major project decisions go through me or Mom first. We need one clear chain of command. I could feel everyone trying not to look at me. Since when? Barbara answered before Daniel could. Since we decided the company needs more structure. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made the humiliation worse. Daniel sighed. Rachel, don't make this difficult. You're good with paperwork. Permits, records, all of that. Let us handle the actual business. That was the sentence I remembered later. 12 years earlier, Daniel and I had built that company together from a rented garage, 1 pickup truck, and a folding table we used as a desk. I had spent years making sure the promises he made to clients could actually be delivered safely, legally, and on time. Now my husband was telling our employees that work wasn't the business. I didn't yell or ask anyone to take my side. I closed the laptop, carried it to Daniel, and placed the company card on top. All right, I said. If that's the structure you want, I'll follow it. Barbara smiled. Daniel nodded, and both of them seemed to believe the hard part was over. They had no idea what I meant. Back in my office, I looked at the paper calendar beside my phone. There were notes in nearly every margin, a permit renewal Daniel had forgotten, an inspection correction Sam wanted reviewed, a subcontractor insurance certificate expiring Friday, 3 change orders missing documentation, and a field adjustment that no longer matched the original drawing. None of those things were disasters. That was the point. For years, I had handled problems while they were still small enough to look unimportant. Most people only notice a system when it fails. If it works well, they assume there was never anything to worry about. Daniel had grown used to that kind of quiet. I had spent so many years solving things before they reached his desk that he had stopped seeing the difference between a company with no problems and a company where someone was constantly preventing them. I wasn't going to sabotage anything, hide information, or let a project drift into danger to prove a point. But if Daniel wanted all authority to run through him and Barbara, then responsibility had to follow the same path. I would do my job carefully. I just wasn't going to keep doing everyone else's job in silence. My name is Rachel Bennett. I was 41 that morning, and Daniel and I had been married for 16 years. If you had met us during the first half of our marriage, you probably would have thought we were one of those couples who had figured out how to work together. I thought so too. Daniel and I met when I was 24 and starting my career in construction engineering. He was 27 and taking residential renovation jobs wherever he could find them. He had a battered pickup, too many tools, and the kind of confidence that made homeowners believe a difficult project would somehow turn out fine. I admired that about him. Daniel could walk into a room where everyone was nervous and make people feel there was a plan. I was the person who wanted to see the plan written down. On one of our first dates, he joked that I could find a problem in a brand new house before anyone removed the protective film from the appliances. I told him he could promise a kitchen renovation before checking whether the wall he wanted removed was carrying half the second floor. He laughed. That was how we were then. His confidence never threatened me, and my caution never embarrassed him. We respected the difference. A few years after we married, Daniel decided he wanted his own company. We had little money and almost no room for mistakes. Our first office was half of a rented garage on the edge of Columbus. In winter, we kept a portable heater near our folding table because cold air leaked around the metal door. Daniel brought in the work. He could talk to a nervous homeowner, understand what they wanted, and make them feel confident enough to sign a contract. I built the systems behind him. I reviewed scopes, tracked permits, organized project documentation, checked changes before they became expensive surprises, and slowly created processes that made the company less dependent on memory and improvisation. We were both working too hard. We were also happy. Our first commercial remodeling job nearly taught us an expensive lesson. Daniel was so excited to land the contract that he wanted to start demolition immediately. I reviewed the drawings and realized part of the planned work required approvals and documentation the estimate barely accounted for. He was frustrated when I told him we needed to slow down. "We finally got a big job, and you want me to tell them we're waiting?" "I want you to tell them the truth before we promise something we can't deliver." He finally called the client. The delay cost us 2 days. Ignoring it would have cost us far more. When the project finished, the client praised Daniel for how smoothly everything had gone. That night, over takeout, he raised his cup toward me. "To the woman who keeps me honest." For years, he kept saying some version of that. As the company grew, our roles became clearer. Daniel built client relationships and crews. I built workflows, reviewed the details that could derail a project, and turned recurring mistakes into systems people could follow. Daniel became the public face of Bennett Renovation and Build. I didn't mind. He was good at it. I preferred the part most people never saw. I liked catching a contradiction before it became a delay. I liked building a process once so 20 people didn't have to solve the same problem 20 different ways. Daniel used to appreciate that. At least, I believed he did. Then Barbara came into the office. Her husband, Frank, died suddenly 3 years before the morning Daniel took my laptop. They had been married more than 40 years. After he died, Barbara seemed to age almost overnight. Daniel worried about her constantly, and so did I. At first she came to our house often. Then Daniel began bringing her to the office because he hated the idea of her sitting alone. One afternoon he asked if she could help us for a while. Just a few hours, phones, receipts, maybe invoices. She needs something to do. I agreed immediately. For the first few months, having Barbara there was genuinely helpful. She answered calls when everyone else was busy, helped organize receipts, remembered birthdays, and brought food when someone worked late. I was grateful. I also understood why Daniel wanted her close. Grief can make ordinary days feel endless, and if the office gave Barbara somewhere to be in the morning, I saw no reason to object. Looking back, I don't think any of us noticed the exact moment helping became belonging, or when belonging became authority. Changes like that rarely arrive with an announcement. They begin with one comment that seems too small to challenge, then another. And eventually you realize someone has been moving the walls while you were busy keeping the roof from leaking. At the time, I still believed every small boundary could be restored later. I had no idea how expensive later would become. For a while, Barbara's opinions were easy to ignore because none of them seemed important enough to become an argument. She questioned why I reviewed certain field changes before Daniel approved them. She wondered why subcontractors needed updated insurance certificates when we had worked with them for years. She thought our project meetings lasted too long and our forms were too detailed. Most of the time I explained the reason once and moved on. Construction has a strange relationship with paperwork. People complain about it when everything is going well, then become very interested when a missing approval delays an inspection or a vague change order costs money. I had learned that the best problems were the ones you prevented before anyone else had to notice them. Barbara saw forms, I saw consequences. At first, that difference was harmless. Then it slowly became a hierarchy. She began answering questions directed to me. If Claire asked about a subcontractor document, Barbara offered an opinion first. If Sam needed a project review, she sometimes told him Daniel could handle it. She started moving meetings around Daniel's schedule, even when I was responsible for leading them. The first time I asked her not to change one of my meetings without checking with me, Daniel came to my office later and said, "Mom's just trying to help." I told him helping and deciding were not the same thing. He brushed it off. Barbara was old-fashioned. She meant well. She had been through a difficult few years. I should not take every comment personally, so I stopped bringing up every comment. That bought us peace in the short term and cost me far more in the long term. When nobody corrects a small falsehood, it has a way of becoming the version everyone remembers. Within months, Barbara was referring to Bennett Renovation and Build as Daniel's company, Daniel's crews, Daniel's clients, Daniel's expansion plans. I noticed every time. Daniel rarely did, or maybe he noticed and no longer thought it mattered. When new employees arrived, Barbara introduced Daniel as the owner and described me as the person who handled operations and paperwork. That description was not completely false. It was simply incomplete in exactly the right way. In practice, I still carried much of the responsibility. I just carried less of the authority. Then came a medical office renovation on the north side of Columbus. Halfway through the project, I noticed a field change Daniel had discussed with the client affected more than the crew realized. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. That was why it mattered. We still had time to correct the sequence and update the documentation before the issue reached inspection. I spent most of a Friday working through it with Sam and an outside consultant. By the end of the day, the project was back on track. A week later, I passed the conference room while Daniel was speaking with a prospective client. He was explaining how our company handled problems before they became delays. Then he described that project. We caught it early. I reorganized the job before it affected the schedule. I kept walking. For several minutes, I told myself the word "I" did not matter. Maybe he meant the company. Maybe he had forgotten exactly how the problem had been discovered. What stayed with me was what happened afterward. Barbara praised him for always seeing trouble before anyone else did. Daniel accepted the compliment. He did not mention me. I had never asked him to announce my contribution every time something went well, but there is a difference between not asking for credit and watching someone slowly absorb it. A few weeks later, Claire sent me a draft of our redesigned company website. The homepage featured Daniel at one of our completed projects. His title read, Founder and President. Barbara appeared below him as Senior Advisor. I had to scroll farther to find myself. My title had been reduced to Operations and Project Documentation. The description focused on permits, records, scheduling support, and administrative coordination. There was no mention that I had co-founded the company or of the systems I had spent years building. The strange part was that almost every sentence about me was true. It was just arranged to make the truth smaller. When I asked Daniel about it, he told me it was only marketing. That answer bothered me more than the website itself. Marketing is the story you choose to tell strangers, and Daniel had chosen a story in which he built the company while I supported it. That was when he finally told me he had been speaking with a group interested in helping us expand into larger commercial projects. The conversations had been going on for weeks. He said he wanted to wait until there was something real to discuss, but there was already something real enough to redesign the company around. I asked why Barbara was listed as a senior advisor while I had disappeared from the founding story. Daniel said potential partners needed a simple structure and that everyone who knew us already understood how much I had contributed. That was the problem. The people who knew us were not the people he was preparing to impress. Nothing had formally changed yet, but the story was changing first. And once people believe a story long enough, they usually find a way to make the structure match it. The answer finally came on a Thursday evening. A client meeting ended early, and I returned to the office after 6 to pick up notes from my desk. Most of the building was dark, but voices were coming from the conference room. Daniel and Barbara were still there, preparing for another expansion call. A third voice came through the speaker. I was walking past when the man on the call asked where I fit into the proposed structure. I stopped. Daniel said I handled forms, permits, and that sort of thing. Barbara described me as excellent with details, while making it clear that Daniel led the business. Then she said the sentence that removed any room for misunderstanding. You don't want it sounding like you need your wife to sign off on you. I waited for Daniel to correct her. He didn't. I know, he said. I walked back to my office without letting them see me. Until then, I had been able to explain almost everything away. Barbara was grieving. Daniel was stressed. The company was growing. Maybe I was too sensitive about titles because I was already frustrated with his mother. But this was different. Daniel was not just overlooking my contribution. He was helping present my authority as something embarrassing. For 16 years, I had believed Daniel understood the difference between standing in front and standing above. He had always been more visible than I was, and I had never confused visibility with importance. Now he was starting to. I sat at my desk and opened the new organizational chart. Daniel's name appeared at the top beside client relations, field operations, project leadership, and strategic growth. My responsibilities were listed underneath: compliance support, documentation, and administrative coordination. Then I looked around my office. Permit schedules were pinned beside the phone. Inspection notes waited for review. Project folders held questions the crews had learned to bring to me before they became expensive. A deadline list covered things nobody else had needed to remember because I always remembered them first. For 12 years, I had treated every gap in the company as a shared problem. If Daniel promised something too quickly, I checked what it would take to deliver it. If a field decision created a documentation problem, I fixed it. If a renewal was approaching, I reminded whoever was responsible before they had a chance to forget. I had never thought of any of that as rescuing Daniel. I thought it was partnership. But authority and responsibility cannot stay separated forever. Daniel wanted the authority. Barbara wanted everyone to see that he had it. And the structure they were building described my work as support. So I made a decision that was much less dramatic than either of them would later claim. I would follow the structure they had created. I would continue every professional responsibility that actually belonged to me. I would protect the company from anything unsafe or improper, do my assigned work carefully, and provide accurate information whenever someone asked for it. What I would stop doing was quietly carrying responsibilities that belonged to people who had excluded me from the decisions behind them. If Daniel approved a change, he could make sure the follow-up happened. If Barbara moved a meeting, she could make sure the right people were available. If Daniel made promises to clients without involving me, I would no longer rearrange everything behind the scenes to make those promises look effortless. I was not trying to make the company fail. I was simply done making everyone else look as if failure had never been possible. For years, Daniel had benefited from problems disappearing before they reached him. Now he wanted a company where everyone knew he was the person in charge. I decided to let him experience exactly what that meant. For the first several days after I decided to follow the new structure exactly as Daniel had created it, almost nothing appeared to change. The crews still arrived at their job sites, clients still called the office, invoices were processed, and Daniel moved through his schedule with the same confidence he always had. If anything, he seemed more relaxed. He had taken control, Barbara was pleased, and the company had not immediately fallen apart, which probably confirmed what both of them already wanted to believe. I had made my role sound more important than it really was. I continued working the same hours and completed every responsibility that properly belonged to me. I reviewed the permits assigned to my side of operations, answered questions when people brought them to me, and made sure nothing unsafe or improper was ignored. The only difference was that I stopped treating every loose end in the company as something I was automatically responsible for fixing. For years, I had carried a mental list that nobody else knew existed. If Daniel made a promise to a client, I usually checked what that promise would require before the crew discovered a conflict. If a project manager approved a field adjustment, I often reviewed the related documentation before anyone remembered to ask. If an insurance certificate was approaching expiration, I sent a reminder. If an inspection depended on information that had not yet been updated, I found the person responsible and made sure it happened. None of those actions looked important individually. That was why they had become invisible. The first small problem appeared on a residential renovation, where a field change had been approved quickly so the crew could keep moving. In the past, I would have seen the change, checked the supporting documentation, and made sure the office record matched what was happening at the job site. This time, I assumed the people with authority over the decision would handle the follow-up. 2 days later, Claire discovered the record had not been updated when she tried to schedule the next inspection. The correction took less than a day, and no one lost a client or suffered any serious consequence. The inspection simply had to be moved. Daniel called it an administrative delay. He was right in the narrowest possible sense. What he did not seem to understand was that administrative delays were still delays, and for years many of them had never reached his attention because I had prevented them before they became visible. A similar situation happened the following week after Daniel agreed to a schedule change for a client. He had always been good at making people feel heard, and that instinct had helped us build the company. Unfortunately, it also meant he occasionally promised a solution before checking what had already been committed elsewhere. Normally, I would have reviewed the downstream schedule, spoken with Sam, and adjusted the internal sequence before the client ever knew there had been a conflict. This time, I left the decision with the people who had made it. Sam eventually discovered that the new date overlapped with work already scheduled for another project. The team still found a solution, but Daniel had to make several calls, rearrange subcontractors, and explain to the client why the timeline needed to move again. Nothing about the incident was extraordinary. That was exactly what made it useful. Daniel had spent years seeing the final version of problems after someone else had already absorbed the inconvenience of solving them. Now he was beginning to experience some of that inconvenience himself. Barbara saw the situation differently. As soon as a few small delays became noticeable, she decided I was doing it intentionally. She told Daniel that I was sulking because he had taken control and later accused me directly of withholding help to prove a point. I asked her to name one responsibility I had failed to complete. She could not. Instead, she told me that a wife who knew how to help her husband should not stand back and watch him struggle. I almost smiled at the contradiction. For months, Barbara had insisted that the things I handled were details Daniel did not need to worry about. Now that those details were becoming visible, she suddenly believed I had a duty to protect him from them again. That was when I understood something I should have recognized much earlier. Barbara did not simply want Daniel to have authority. She wanted him to have authority without having to carry all the responsibility that came with it. Those are not the same thing. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued in small, ordinary ways. A subcontractor's paperwork had to be updated at the last minute because nobody had remembered the expiration date. A permit question sat longer than usual because Daniel assumed someone else was tracking it. A project change reached the office without the notes Claire needed, forcing her to spend half a morning reconstructing what had been decided at the job site. The company was not failing, it was simply becoming less effortless. That difference mattered because Daniel had mistaken effortlessness for proof that the effort did not exist. Claire was the first employee to begin noticing the larger pattern. She had joined Bennett Renovation and Build 5 years earlier, long after most of our internal systems had already been created. To her, the checklists, project folders, permit tracking, review schedules, and renewal reminders were simply how the company worked. She had never seen the years when Daniel and I built those systems one problem at a time. One afternoon, she came to me with a documentation issue on a commercial renovation and asked whether we had ever dealt with anything similar. I told her to check the archived project files. Later that day, she returned with a binder from 6 years earlier. Inside was a project that had encountered almost the same kind of problem. My notes showed what had gone wrong, how it had been corrected, and the process I had created afterward so the same mistake would be less likely to happen again. Claire had always assumed that particular checklist came from one of our outside consultants. It had come from me. Several days later, she found another older project with a similar history. The circumstances were different, but the pattern was familiar. A problem had surfaced, I had documented the cause, and the company had changed the way it worked afterward. That was how I had always approached the business. Solving a problem once kept a project moving. Learning from it kept the company moving. I had never thought of those systems as evidence of my importance. They were simply part of the work. The irony was that because they worked, most people no longer remembered why they existed. Daniel understood the company through a different set of memories. He remembered the clients he won, the crews he built, the difficult conversations he handled, and the projects that ended successfully. Those accomplishments were real. I had never wanted to take them away from him. I simply remembered another version of the same history, the permit that almost delayed a project, the change order that almost created a dispute, the sequence that had to be corrected before inspection, the promises that needed to be adjusted before they became commitments. For years, those two versions of the company had fit together. The problem began when Daniel decided only one of them counted as leadership. Even then, he had reasons to believe the new structure was working. The expansion discussions continued, and the group he had been speaking with remained interested. They liked our growth, our reputation, and the possibility of moving into larger commercial projects. After one especially promising meeting, Daniel came home in a better mood than I had seen in weeks. Barbara treated the progress as proof that the company had finally become more efficient under Daniel's leadership. She talked about the expansion as if removing me from major decisions had somehow unlocked the future they had both been waiting for. I did not argue with her. I had never wanted the company to fail just so I could be proven right. Bennett Renovation and Build employed people I respected, supported families I knew personally, and represented 12 years of my own life. If Daniel succeeded in expanding it, part of me would still have been proud. My boundary had never been about revenge. It was about refusing to keep carrying the weight of decisions I was no longer allowed to help make. Daniel misunderstood that silence as agreement. One afternoon, after another successful call with the expansion group, he stopped near my office and told me everything was going well. Then he said, "See, we're fine." There was no cruelty in his voice. If anything, he sounded relieved. That made the moment more painful. He truly believed the last few weeks had confirmed his view of the company. The delays were minor. The expansion was moving forward. Barbara was satisfied. Rachel was still handling the paperwork. From where he stood, nothing essential had changed. I told him I was glad the meeting had gone well. For a short time, I even wondered whether he might be right. Perhaps the company would adapt. Perhaps other people would gradually learn the work I had always handled. If that happened, I could live with it. I did not need the company to depend on me in order to feel valuable. What I needed was to be treated honestly. The situation changed when one of our larger commercial projects developed a problem that could not be explained away as a forgotten certificate or a scheduling inconvenience. Several field decisions had been made over time, each one reasonable when viewed by itself. The difficulty was that the changes affected one another, and the project documentation no longer told one consistent story about what had been approved, what had changed, and what the team now intended to complete. No one had done anything reckless, and the project was still manageable, but the outside consultant reviewing the work began asking questions that required more than a quick answer. Who had approved the earlier change? Had the later adjustment been reviewed against it? Where was the supporting documentation? Why had the sequence changed without the earlier record being reconciled? Daniel knew part of the history. Sam knew another part. Claire could find the documents that had reached the office. What nobody could immediately explain was how all the decisions connected. That was the kind of problem I had spent years catching while it was still spread across 3 different conversations and 2 different job files. By the time everyone else could see it, the easy version of the problem was already gone. The timing made the situation worse for Daniel, because one of the people involved in the expansion discussions had been invited to observe part of the operational review. Daniel wanted to demonstrate that our company had the internal discipline required for larger commercial work. Instead, the meeting exposed a gap he had spent weeks insisting did not matter. At first, he described the situation as another paperwork issue. The consultant listened to the explanation, reviewed the project history, and eventually asked a question that changed the direction of the meeting. Who normally catches this before it gets this far? For the first time since Daniel had changed the company structure, there was no simple answer that made his version of the business look complete. Sam finally mentioned that we had dealt with similar situations before and suggested checking some of the archived projects. Those records lined an entire wall of the operations room. Over the years, the binders had become so familiar that most of us barely noticed them. Each one represented a project that was already finished, which meant the problems inside had been solved long enough ago for everyone to forget how much work they had once required. Sam pulled one of the older files and found a commercial renovation from 6 years earlier. The circumstances were different, but the pattern was close enough to be useful. My notes showed where I had identified the conflict, how the team had corrected it, and what had changed in our process afterward. Claire found another project that contained the same kind of history. Again, my name was in the review. Again, the solution had later become part of the way the company operated. No one had uncovered a secret. Those records had been available for years. That was what made the moment uncomfortable. The evidence had never been hidden. It had simply become ordinary enough to ignore. Daniel had walked past that wall thousands of times without thinking of it as anything more than completed project files. I had done the same, because I never imagined I would one day need those binders to explain what I had contributed to my own company. As Sam continued looking through the records, a pattern that had been invisible in daily life began to appear across years of finished work. Daniel remembered the projects that succeeded. I remembered many of the things that had almost prevented them from succeeding. Both histories were true. For the first time, he was being forced to see them side by side, and there were still dozens of binders on the wall. The longer we stayed with those old project files, the harder it became to dismiss what they represented. Sam found another commercial renovation where a field decision had created a conflict with something that had already been approved, and the notes showed that I had caught the problem before inspection, coordinated the correction, and then changed our internal process so the same mistake would be less likely to happen again. Claire found a different project where a client request had affected both the schedule and the scope of work, and once again the file showed that what everyone remembered as a smooth recovery had required several decisions behind the scenes before the problem ever became visible to the client. None of the individual examples were dramatic enough to explain 12 years of work by themselves. That was exactly why the pattern mattered. Some involved permits, others involved scheduling, subcontractor documentation, field changes, insurance requirements, or promises made to clients before every consequence had been considered. What connected them was not that I had been secretly running the company while Daniel did nothing. He had built the crews, developed relationships, won work, handled difficult clients, and made decisions I could never have made as effectively as he did. My contribution had always been different. I noticed where one decision touched another, then tried to deal with the connection before it became somebody else's emergency. For years, that division had worked, because Daniel and I both understood that we were looking at the same company from different directions. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing the difference between work that happened in front of people and work that prevented problems from reaching them. The folders along that wall did not suddenly make me more important than he was, but they made it impossible to keep pretending that the part of the company he called paperwork existed separately from the part he considered the real business. Sam eventually explained it more simply than I ever had. Daniel was the person who could walk into a difficult room, calm a client, organize a crew, and keep everyone moving when a project started to feel uncertain. I was the person people came to when a decision that looked simple in one room had consequences in 3 others. Neither role had ever been enough on its own, and the company had grown because those 2 kinds of leadership had supported each other for years. I watched Daniel absorb that without trying to defend himself. He had spent the last several weeks insisting that the new structure was proof the company did not need my involvement in the way I believed it did, but now he was looking at finished projects he remembered as successes and discovering how many of them contained a part of the history he had never bothered to learn. He remembered the client who thanked him for saving a schedule. The file showed the weekend I had spent rebuilding the sequence after a change had been promised too quickly. He remembered a project that passed inspection without trouble. The notes showed the issue Sam had brought me days earlier and the correction we made before the inspector ever arrived. He remembered growth, momentum, and the confidence that came from believing his company knew how to solve problems. I remembered how many of those problems had first appeared as small inconsistencies that somebody had to take seriously before they became expensive. The most uncomfortable part was that none of this had been hidden from him. The records had always been there. I had never kept a secret account of my contributions or saved evidence because I expected to defend myself one day. Daniel had access to the same files, the same systems, and the same project history. He simply had no reason to study them while everything was working, and because I had never demanded recognition, he had gradually confused my silence with proof that there was nothing important to recognize. Barbara resisted longer than he did. She argued that husbands and wives helped each other all the time and that turning ordinary teamwork into a list of contributions would destroy any marriage. I understood the argument because I had believed some version of it myself for most of my adult life. I had never wanted to count favors, compare hours, or remind Daniel of every problem I solved. Marriage was not supposed to work like an invoice, and I still believed that. What Barbara refused to see was that I was not asking anyone to repay me. I was asking them to stop using my willingness to help as evidence that the help had no value. There is a difference between giving freely and disappearing completely inside what you give. I had never resented Daniel for accepting my help, but I could no longer ignore the fact that he had accepted it for so long that he had begun telling other people a story in which there was almost nothing to accept. The same woman who had spent months reducing my contribution to details and paperwork was now telling me I should continue protecting Daniel from those same details because that was what a good wife would do. The contradiction was so complete that I no longer felt the need to argue with it. The meeting eventually returned to the reason we had gathered in the first place. We still had an active project to fix, and the outside consultant cared far more about whether we could correct the process than about the disagreement inside our marriage. We reviewed the changes, reconstructed the sequence of decisions, clarified who would own each step going forward, and agreed that several internal systems needed to be tightened before the company moved any further with expansion. The representative who had been observing us did not threaten to walk away. His response was practical. Growing companies developed weaknesses, but larger companies could not afford leaders who refused to understand where those weaknesses came from. That comment stayed with Daniel. For weeks, he had treated leadership as the right to make the final decision. By the end of that meeting, he was beginning to understand that authority was only the visible half of the job. The other half was carrying responsibility for what happened after the decision was made, especially when the consequences were inconvenient enough that somebody else had previously been absorbing them. When everyone finally left, Daniel stayed behind. I returned to my office because there was still work waiting for me, and almost half an hour passed before he came in. He did not begin with a speech about how wrong he had been. Instead, he asked why I had never told him how much of that work I was doing. I had asked myself the same question before, and the answer had not changed. I never told him because I thought we were partners. When a problem reached my side of the company, I solved it. When something reached his, he solved it. I did not believe every contribution needed an announcement because I assumed we both understood that the finished result belonged to both of us. That assumption had worked for years, until Daniel began enjoying a version of the company in which his contribution was visible and mine was described as support. He admitted that more openly than I expected. As the company became more successful, people started treating him like the man who had built something impressive. Clients remembered his name, employees looked to him first, the expansion group listened when he spoke. Barbara reinforced that image constantly, and Daniel liked the way it felt. At first, he knew the story was incomplete and simply allowed people to believe it. Later, he stopped correcting them. Eventually, he started repeating it himself. That admission mattered more to me than an immediate apology would have. It meant he finally understood that Barbara had influenced him, but she had not forced him. He had chosen the version of our history that made him feel larger, and the easiest way to protect that version was to make my role appear smaller. I told him that the laptop and company card had never been the real injury. What hurt was learning that my own husband could stand in front of people who had watched us build a company together and describe me as though I were an employee who handled forms in the background. Even worse, he had allowed his mother to turn my authority into something that supposedly diminished him as a man. For 16 years, I had respected Daniel's strengths without needing them to become evidence of my weakness. I needed to know whether he was capable of doing the same for me. He said he was sorry, and I believed him, but believing an apology and trusting the person who gives it are not the same thing. I had no interest in returning to the arrangement we had before, simply because he finally understood why it had become unfair. The company needed written responsibilities that matched actual authority. Major decisions could no longer be made around me and then returned to me when the consequences appeared, and the public story of Bennett Renovation and Build needed to reflect the fact that we had founded it together. Barbara could still be his mother and part of our family, but she could no longer hold authority inside our business simply because Daniel had found it easier to agree with her than to draw a boundary. Daniel agreed, but I asked him not to agree out of guilt. Guilt creates promises very quickly and keeps very few of them. If anything was going to change, he had to understand the structure we were fixing rather than simply feel ashamed about the way it had failed. The conversation with Barbara happened 2 days later and was more difficult, partly because her interference had never been only about the company. By then, I understood that the office had simply given her a place to express something that had been growing since her husband died. For more than 40 years, Barbara had built much of her identity around being needed by her family. When Frank died, she lost not only the man she loved, but also the daily role that had told her who she was. Helping at our office gave some of that purpose back. Answering phones became organizing things became giving advice, and giving advice eventually became deciding which decisions she believed Daniel should be allowed to make without me. Barbara admitted that the more independent Daniel became, the more frightened she was that he would stop needing her. My competence did not reassure her because she had begun to see me as the person replacing the role she had once occupied in his life. Instead of admitting that fear, she convinced herself she was protecting him from becoming too dependent on his wife. That explanation did not excuse what she had done, but it finally made the pattern understandable. She had spent months telling Daniel that a strong husband should not need his wife's approval because needing people had become the thing she feared most. In trying to protect her place in his life, she had taught him to confuse partnership with weakness. We agreed that Barbara would step away from the daily operations of the company. I did not ask Daniel to cut her out of our family, and I did not want her punished for the rest of her life. What I wanted was a boundary that should have existed from the beginning. Our marriage belonged to Daniel and me, and our company would be managed by people who had defined responsibilities, not by whoever happened to be related to the owner. The changes that followed were much less dramatic than the meeting that forced them. Daniel corrected the company website and restored my co-founder status, but the title mattered less to me than the internal changes behind it. We rewrote responsibilities so that authority and accountability stayed together, and Daniel began attending parts of the operational process he had ignored for years. He learned that reviewing a field change was not the same thing as slowing down a crew, that permit questions were rarely isolated from scheduling, and that one quick promise to a client could create 3 different problems somewhere else if nobody checked the connections. He did not become an expert overnight, and I did not expect him to. I had spent years learning that work myself. What mattered was that he stopped treating the work as lesser simply because it happened away from clients and job sites. Over the next several months, I watched for behavior rather than apologies. When a client praised a process I had developed, Daniel gave me credit without looking toward me first to see whether I noticed. When a project manager asked a question that belonged to my authority, he sent the question to me instead of answering because he wanted to appear decisive. When he was unsure about a change, he asked before making the promise rather than expecting me to reorganize everything afterward. Those were small decisions, but small decisions were how we had gotten into trouble in the first place. Trust rarely disappears because of one terrible conversation. More often, it is worn down by ordinary moments in which one person repeatedly learns that their place can be ignored without consequence. Rebuilding it happens the same way, except in reverse. Barbara changed more slowly. Without the office to organize, she struggled to find another routine, but eventually she began volunteering with a local nonprofit that helped older homeowners coordinate repairs they could no longer manage by themselves. The work suited her better than any of us expected. She was organized, persistent, and very good at getting contractors to return phone calls. More importantly, it gave her a place to feel useful that did not require taking authority over her son's marriage. Our relationship never returned to exactly what it had been before, and I eventually understood that it did not need to. I could care about Barbara without giving her unlimited access to my decisions. She could love Daniel without helping him run our marriage. Boundaries did not destroy the family. They made it possible for us to be in the same family without constantly fighting over who had the right to control it. Almost a year after the morning Daniel took my laptop, a new commercial client came to our office. I was reviewing a project file when Daniel walked in with him, and after a few minutes they stopped beside my desk. Daniel introduced me simply. "This is Rachel Bennett, my partner." He did not say I handled paperwork. He did not introduce me as his wife and then explain what I helped with. He did not give a speech about everything I had contributed over 12 years. He used the word that had mattered from the beginning. Later that afternoon, I passed the wall of archived project binders in the operations room. They looked exactly the way they always had, and I was glad nobody had turned them into some kind of monument to me. The lesson was never that I had secretly built the entire company while Daniel stood around taking credit. He had worked hard, and so had I. The company succeeded because our strengths had once fit together without either of us needing the other person to become smaller. What nearly destroyed that partnership was not ambition, expansion, or even Barbara's interference by itself. It was the moment Daniel began believing that respect had to be divided, as if recognizing my authority somehow reduced his own. I used to think being a good partner meant solving every problem you were capable of solving without asking whether someone else should have carried part of the weight. I do not believe that anymore. Sometimes doing too much in silence teaches people that your effort costs nothing, and sometimes avoiding confrontation does not preserve peace at all. It only postpones the day when somebody finally has to admit what that peace was costing. I never regretted handing Daniel the laptop that morning because I had not done it to punish him. I had done it because I could no longer protect a version of our partnership that only existed when I stayed quiet enough for everyone else to feel comfortable. Once I stopped making everything look effortless, Daniel finally saw how much effort had always been there. And once he saw it, he had to decide whether he wanted to remain the man everyone saw at the front of the company or become the partner I had believed I was building a life with. He chose the second. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is that quiet work is not unimportant simply because someone makes it look easy, and love should never require one person to become smaller so the other can feel strong. The healthiest partnerships are not built around who gets the final word. They are built when both people understand the weight the other person has been carrying and respect it before that weight has to be dropped. If this story reminded you of someone whose work is often overlooked, I hope you share it with them. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, second chances, and people finally learning the value of those they took for granted, I would be honored to have you back for the next one.